So here's the thing. We do not monetize our videos. That means that everything from attracting viewers to our videos to making money off of them is left up to us.
Why don't you do us a favor and tell your friends and family about our channel, because we're sure that they know someone that will love our content.
And since you're here, make sure you buy us a coffee at the link below. Each coffee prop donates $3 to this channel, and all the money donated will go towards content content off of this channel.
Also on our Ko-fi page, check out our shop where you can watch the unedited versions of commercial breaks and buy cool merchandise we made ourselves. Mostly.
And if that's not enough, what if we told you that those who give to the channel will get a mention at the end of each video? So visit the link below and help support this channel through the power of a cup of coffee.
And to those already donating, thank you for supporting the channel. And with that, let's begin.
Hello again, and as promised, we have for you another programming block from CCTV4. And if you like the previous block, you're in for a treat, because this block is much more longer than the other one, and we'll tell you the contents of this block in just a moment. But first, as we said in the last video, we said that this block will be joined by a friend or two. Marcy, can you tell them what it is?
Absolutely, David. So he's a sociologist whose views have pretty much reflected that of Marxists, and he's well known for devising a theory of how we perceive race in the media. His name is Stuart Hall. And for those who don't know who he is, Hall is a Jamaican-born sociologist who was based in the capital city of England. Hall devoted most of his career speaking out against the inequities of how race and gender is portrayed, especially through the media, and reflected his views in his representation theory, which according to the men,
what this idea that media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations. What we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about.
While his work remains largely forgotten, he has served as an influence to many people, not only in the field of sociology, but also to those in the filmmaking business. Now, if you were to go online, you can find that a high-quality copy of the lecture in its entirety can be viewed for free, compared to our low-quality copy, which is incomplete and is out of sync. But we felt uploading this was important since we felt Hall's analysis of the media and how it works was very relevant, especially at a time like this. And I meant, not only did this lecture influence the way I see the media, but, while it's pretty subtle, this lecture played an influence on this channel's rebranding.
The next block of programming from CCTV starts after a 3-minute commercial break on DUTV. The first program on the block, a newscast from the broadcaster, follows a brief block of commercials on CCTV. While it's in Chinese, the newscast reveals the very day this recording was made. When that wraps up, we are taken to what we choose, an entertainment talk show. You know, the type of shows that can best define the view for the final hours of most morning drive programs. Once again, everything is in Chinese, but we assume that the man and woman being interviewed are in the entertainment industry, and they're here to promote something they'll be involved with.
是看着电视长大的，
对，
你们是长到了10几岁，然后才看上了彩色的电视。
10几岁，哎呦，都快30岁了。
You know David is in me, or does everyone look like they could all be family members? But anyway, after some interstitials, we are taken to the third, final, and only English language program. Around China is the news magazine that, as its title suggests, presents viewers with human interest stories on the many citizens of the aforementioned country.
The block ends midway through a piece on a calligraphy artist that uses force to create his designs, and that does lead us to the second friend we mentioned. Just what it is? Well, you're gonna have to figure that out when the time comes. But for now, let's join Stuart Hall as he explains to us his representation theory.
The usual meaning of this term is connected with whether the depiction of something is an accurate or distorted reflection. In contrast to this, Hall argues for a new view that gives the concept of representation a much more active and creative role in relation to the way people think about the world and their place within it. This new view of representation is central to thinking about communication in much more complex ways. Hall shows that an image can have many different meanings, that there is no guarantee that images will work in the way we think they will when we create them. Now, sometimes Hall's concern with drawing attention to the complexity of communication is seen as downplaying the idea that the media have real and strong effects on the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. Hall understands that communication is always linked with power, that those groups who wield power in a society influence what gets represented through the media. Hall wants to hold both these ideas, that messages work in complex ways and that they are always connected with the way power operates in any society, together at the same time. He examines our everyday world where knowledge and power intersect. One way he does that is through what he calls interrogation of the image. The idea of interrogation normally brings to mind asking hard questions of a suspect. But how do we interrogate an image? By examining it, asking the hard questions about it, rather than just accepting it at face value. Just as a good interrogator looks behind the suspect's story or alibi, so must we probe inside and behind the image. Why should we think this way about images? Marshall McLuhan once said he wasn't sure who discovered water, but he was pretty sure it wasn't a fish. In other words, when we are immersed in something, surrounded by it the way we are by images from the media, we may come to accept them as just part of the real and natural world. We just swim through them, unthinkingly absorbing them as fish in water. What cultural studies would like us to do is to step out of the water in a sense and look at it, see how it shapes our existence, and even critically examine the content of the water. What follows is a talk that Stuart Hall gave at the University of Westminster in London. I hope your response mirrors my own when I first heard him lecture. I was an undergraduate student in England in the 1970s, and Stuart came to speak at the university I was attending. Through his energy, his passion, his modesty, he convinced me of the value of what he calls the intellectual vocation, the notion that ideas matter, that they are worth struggling over, that they have something to tell us about and can influence the world out there beyond the academy. In this way, he insists on the role that intellectual work can play in helping to regain control of an image-dominated world that has drifted beyond the democratic reach of ordinary people.
Just let me say what the main theme of what I'm going to say today is. I'm going to talk about the notion of representation, which is a very common concept in cultural studies and in media studies kinds of work. But I want to explore the idea a little bit, and I want to try and say something about how I understand representation working and why it's a more difficult and more complex subject than it appears to begin with. I'm talking about largely visual representation, or the examples I'm going to try to cite are from visual representation, but I think what I'm going to say has a bearing on the practices of representation in general. I choose visual representation because it's a kind of cliche to say that in the modern world our culture is saturated by the image in a variety of different forms. The image itself, whether moving or still, and whether transmitted by a variety of different media, seems to be able to have become the privileged sign of late modern culture. And late modern culture is not only that culture which one finds in the advanced industrial, post-industrial societies of the Western world, but because of the global explosion in communication systems, it is also the saturating medium, the saturating idiom of communication worldwide. So I think to try and take the idea of representation to the image is an important question. And cultural studies has paid a tremendous amount of attention in one way or another to the centrality of representations and of the practice of representation, and media studies itself is, in an obvious sense, concerned in part with the variety of different texts, in my instance, visual texts, representations, which are transmitted by the media. But I'm going to stand back from that a bit to begin with and try and look at the process of representation itself. Now, the word has a kind of double meaning, even in its common sense, understanding. It does mean to present, to image, to depict, to offer a depiction of something else. And the word representation or representation does sort of carry with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. Nevertheless, this notion that somehow representation represents a meaning which is already there is a very common idea, and on the other hand, one of the ideas that I'm going to try to subvert. So I give you the common sense meaning to try to take it back a little bit in what I'm going to say. But then there's another understanding of the word representation which also plays a role in what we bring to this topic, because we speak of political figures as representing us in some way. We don't probably say that very often these days because we may not think they represent us very well, but they're sort of supposed to represent us, and in that sense, they stand in for us. They are our representatives. Where we can't be, they can be. So the notion of something which images and depicts and that which stands in for something else, both of those ideas are kind of brought together in the notion of representation. Now, what this idea that the media practices, among other things, represent topics, represent types of people, represent events, represent situations. What we're talking about is the fact that in the notion of representation is the idea of giving meaning. So the representation is the way in which meaning is somehow given to the things which are depicted through the images or whatever it is on screens or the words on a page which stand for what we're talking about. And if you think that the meaning that it is giving is very different from or a kind of distortion of what it really means, then your work on representation would be in measuring that gap between what one might think of as the true meaning of an event or an object and how it is presented in the media. And there's a lot of very good work which is in media studies which is exactly like this. I think the truth is that in cultural studies now, and in a great deal of media studies work, that notion of representation is regarded as too literal and too straightforward. And the reason for that is because we want to ask the question of whether events, the meaning of people, groups, what they're doing, etc., whether these things do have any one essential, fixed, or true meaning against which we could measure, as it were, the level of distortion in the way in which they're represented. Suppose one says, yes, I can see that people are meeting now in Northern Ireland to discuss the Northern Ireland situation. But what it means, what is the meaning of that meeting, is a very complicated thing to decide. You'd have to know not only the whole history of what led up to it, you'd have to know what each of the participants wants out of it, you'd have to know some assessment of what the consequences of that event are likely to be, before you could say, what is the meaning? And we all know absolutely clearly the one thing you can be certain of is that there will never be one interpretation of what is going on in Northern Ireland today. Absolutely. It will always be a contested question. There will never be a finally settled, fixed meaning. The one thing you can say about those events is that there is no one true fixed meaning about it. Well, now, this is a different situation. In a way, what we're saying now is that representation doesn't really capture the process at all, because there was nothing absolutely fixed there in the first place to represent. Of course, there was something. People are meeting, they're talking, they're arguing with one another, they're going to take decisions, consequences will follow. So, not that nothing is happening in the world, but what is dubious is what is the true meaning of it. And the true meaning of it will depend on what meaning people make of it. And the meanings that they make of it depends on how it is represented. The meaning of an event in Northern Ireland does not exist until it has been represented. And that's a very different process. Now we're talking about representation, not as an after-the-event activity. It means something, and then the presentation might change or distort the meaning. We're talking about the fact that it has no fixed meaning, no real meaning in the obvious sense, until it has been represented. And the representations, since they're likely to be very different as you move from one person to another, one group or another, one part of society and another, one historical moment and another, just as those forms of representation will change, so the meaning of the event will change. Now, what this means is, in fact, that the process of representation has entered into the event itself. It doesn't, in a way, it doesn't exist meaningfully until it has been represented. And that, to put that in a more highfalutin way, is to say that representation doesn't occur after the event. Representation is constitutive of the event. It enters into the constitution of the object that we're talking about. It is part of the object itself. It is constitutive of it. It is one of its conditions of existence. And therefore representation is not outside the event, not after the event, but within the event itself. It is constitutive of it. If cultural studies was simply about trying to understand the distortions which the media make of a meaning whose truth we could somehow find independently of the media, it would be a very different kind of study from what it is in fact, which is trying to find out how the meanings enter into the event themselves, how they help to constitute the event. And this, what we're talking about is really why in cultural and media studies of this kind, at any rate, the notion of culture becomes a primary force. It's not a secondary element, but it's a primary element. Culture is the way in which we make sense of or give meaning to things of one sort or another. It's true, of course, that we all don't make sense of things in the same way, and therefore that each of us has a little kind of conceptual world of our own, or rather we have our own sort of take on the conceptual world. But if we shared no concepts together with other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in, broadly speaking, the same ways. Cultures consist of the maps of meaning, the frameworks of intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists but is ambiguous as to its meaning until we've made sense of it. So meaning arises because of the shared conceptual maps which groups or members of a culture or society share together. And that's a very important kind of way of coming to an understanding of why in cultural studies, if you privilege the notion of representation as giving meaning, you're making culture a very central, you're giving it a kind of central role. Yes, it's not just sort of the values and things which we happen to have been born into. It literally is the ways without which we would find the world unintelligible. Okay, what then is sort of the basis of a culture, consequently of cultural studies, is to try to begin with what are the shared conceptual maps. That's to put it another way, to give you another way into this notion. What are the ways in which we classify and organize the world? Because classification is not the only, but one of the principal ways in which we go about giving meaning to things. Until we know roughly what class of things it is, roughly what it belongs with, and roughly what it's different from. Chairs are like stools because you sit on them, and both of them are different from tables which you put things on, although you can also sit on tables. So our systems of classification are very complex, but without some notion of this belongs with that, that is different from this, we wouldn't be able to have a conceptual map. We wouldn't be able to map out the world in some intelligible way. Now, where do we get that from? Well, the one thing you can be certain is that though the capacity to use concepts and to classify concepts in this way is a biological or genetic phenomenon, it's a feature of how we are constituted as human beings, the particular classifications that we use to classify out the world meaningfully is not printed in anybody's genes. It is something which is learned. It may not be learned in didactic ways at school or in colleges or through instruction, formal instruction, but to become a human subject is precisely somehow to learn or internalize the shared maps of meaning with other people in your culture. To become a cultured subject, rather than a biological individual, rather than just a blob of genetic material, is to move from there, to internalize, have within oneself the kind of the beginnings of the grid of one's culture. Okay, one could say then that the conceptual maps in our heads which allow us to come to a sense of what is going on in the world is itself a system of representation. Our concepts are a way of representing the world. And you can think of that in a very simple way. I mean, bear in mind an object which you cannot see. Now, unless you had a concept of it, it would disappear the moment that the object had gone from sight. But concepts allow us to store and indeed to refer to and to think about quite complicated thoughts about objects which are no longer accessible to our perceptual apparatus. So the concepts allow us also to think about a wide range of things which are not in any simple sense out there in the world. And it's a very rich notion. Our fantasy life is full of things which are absolutely real to us, which are probably real if we can only find a language to express them. Lots of other people which nobody's ever seen. So we're beginning to dissolve now any simple-minded notion that our concepts are just mirror images of the world out there, also mirror images of worlds that don't exist. So our concepts operate as a system of representation, but we haven't finished the circle yet, because suppose we all shared the same conceptual map. That's to say, we made sense of the world in roughly the same way. And we classify those concepts. We have the same system of classification in our head. How would I know that you are making sense of the world in anything remotely like the way in which I am? I can only know that if you could in some way express or communicate the sense you are making to somebody else. And that second move requires that the concepts find their way through language into communication. So we've not talked about communication yet, but you see, the question of communication and language completes the circle of representation. First of all, there's the shared conceptual maps or cultures that we inhabit, but very closely associated with that are the ways in which different languages, and by language here, of course, I mean a very wide range of things. I mean the language that we speak, I mean the language that we write, I mean electronic languages, digital languages, languages communicated by musical instrument, languages communicated by facial gesture, languages communicated by facial expression, the use of the body to communicate meaning, the use of clothes to express meaning. Anything in the sense in which I'm talking about can be a language. By that I mean it gives sign to the meanings that we have in a form which can be communicated to other people. Language externalizes, it makes available and accessible as a social fact, a social process, the meanings that we are making of the world and of events. And it's at that point that the representation really begins to take off, close the circle of representation. One of the things which people who've gotten to this point without sort of understanding where they're going suddenly want to say is, oh my goodness, are you telling me that there is nothing but language, nothing but discourse? The only thing that exists is meaning. And this is a very common complaint. It sort of occurs, for those of you who teach media studies, in about, the middle of the second term. Really, is my view. That's about the point where students suddenly shake their heads, wake up, and say, it's nonsense, There are lots of things in the world apart from meaning and language. How do you trap me into this sort of language box, this language circle, How do you get me into this circle anyway? Then let me try and make a very simple distinction about two statements which sound as if they're exactly the same, which in my view are absolutely different. The first statement is, nothing meaningful exists outside of discourse. I think that statement is true. On the other hand, nothing exists outside of discourse. In my view, that statement is wrong. The statement, nothing exists outside of discourse, is a sort of claim that, as it were, there is no material existence, no material world at all, no objects out there, and that is patently not the case. But to say that nothing meaningful exists outside of discourse is a way of summing up what I think I've been trying to say to you. As far as meaning is concerned, you need discourse, i.e. the frameworks of understanding and interpretation, to make meaningful sense of it. And I'll try to give you an example. Round, spherical, rubber or leather object is a ball. Is it a football? Well, you need a round spherical object to play football. But it's only football in the context of a set of rules about what you can and can't do with the ball, which the ball didn't make up. You have to make up. So the ball only, which is a physical object, only becomes meaningful as a football within the context of the rules of the game. It's only when you develop a game or a language game about football. You can put it there, you can't put it there, you can't touch it, you can't kick it, etc. Within the rules, it becomes a football. So it's meaningful as a football only in the context of the use and the meanings with which it is invested. The notion that meaning is important doesn't require us to deny that human beings have physical existence, that objects have a physical existence, that we live in a material world which is governed by the laws of the physical world, and so on. It doesn't require any of that. The question of discourse and of frameworks of intelligibility is about how people give meaning to those things, how they become meaningful, not whether they exist or not. And there has been, I think, in a lot of cultural studies work, a kind of slippage around this question of if meaning is constitutive, does it mean that nothing exists except language. You do hear a lot of objections to the position I'm putting by saying, oh, you've sort of absorbed the whole world into language. And that is not what I'm saying, but I am saying, though, that without language, meaning could not be exchanged in the world. That is the position that I would take. Without language, and I use language here in the broad sense, so I'm reminding you, different media using different sign systems, etc., but nevertheless, without language, no representation. Without language, no meaning. I want to take an example in which some of the ways in which people in cultural studies and media studies have tried to explore this process of making or the production of meaning, how they try to get into what we call the practices that produce meaning. And that idea, incidentally, is a very important one, the notion that the production of meaning is not therefore something that just happens because the world is already fixed out in its meanings, which don't change. The production of meaning means that there is a kind of symbolic work, an activity, a practice which has to go on in giving meaning to things and in communicating that meaning to someone else. And it is that practice of the production of meaning, the practice of what are called signifying practices, practices that are involved in the production of meaning, that media studies is concentrated on the effects and the products of signifying practices, practices that are carrying meaning and that in our world happen to be widely circulated by the media being one of the most powerful and extensive systems for the circulation of meaning, although one ought to always remind oneself, especially in media studies, that the media are by no means the only means by which meaning is circulated in our society. I mean, the most obvious way is in actual talk and conversation with other people, in personal communication. That is the medium in which the exchange of meaning absolutely saturates the world. But of course we are right noticing that to see what happens when systems, complicated institutional systems with complicated technologies, then intervene and take the place of face-to-face, person-to-person communication and exchange, and the means of circulating those meanings become very widespread. Because, of course, the question of the circulation of meaning almost immediately involves the question of power. Who has the power, in what channels, to circulate which meanings to who? But it's why the issue of power can never be bracketed out from the question of representation. I want to remind you of an image which I think many people may have seen both on television and in the press and in magazines. The picture of Linford Christie at the end of the Olympics with a Union Jack around his shoulders after his victory in the 100 meters. What would you say is the meaning of this image? The captain of the British Olympic team is black. But he's British because he's got the Union Jack, and if there's any signifier left apart from John Bull and British beef, the Union Jack is it as a signifier of what being British is. So somehow, this person, who isn't what one thinks of normally as the majority cultural identity and ethnic identity or racial identity of the majority of British people, because the majority of British people, though the word British doesn't carry with it any specific reference at all to questions of race or color, one assumes that the British Olympic team might be full of white British people, and here is somebody who's obviously not. Now, I'm sure you can see what I'm going to say about this. I'm going to say that this meaning, though it may not be the first thing you thought about, but this meaning manifestly has to do with the relationship between what you expected to find in the first place, which is nowhere visible in the image, contrasted with what actually is in the image. And this is a complicated way, this is a simple way of saying what is sometimes expressed in very complicated form, that absence means something, signifies as much as presence. But what signifies is, of course, what is marked, what is in some way visibly there and has been drawn attention to. So the fact that he's black, the fact that he's a winning athlete, the fact that he's carrying the British flag, all those things are marked, but the meaning is not simply in those things, but it's in them insofar as they subvert our expectations, the expectations we brought to them, which nobody has said anything about at all. Nobody has marked this at all, but nevertheless, as if in this empty open field, the very marking of him as black and British has invoked that which is not said, but what is not said is as important to what is said as the things that are actually in the picture. That every image that we see is being read in part against what isn't there. But a second interesting thing might be the question, well, there is Linford Christie. He is the captain of the British Olympic team. He is a winner, and you don't see all that many blacks in a winning situation. He is claiming something about being British because he's wearing the flag, but he doesn't look like what you would expect the majority of British athletes to look like. What is going on here? Well, part of what is going on is the second thing, which is a kind of claim, a kind of identity claim, a claim of who the thing is or to what does it belong, is made in the way in which it is invested in the practice of representation itself. So that without, Linford Christie may not know anything at all about identity politics, but nevertheless, for the whole thing to make sense, there is a kind of claim on recognition as a certain kind of person. And, you may think that this is far-fetched because this is a very special example. But just think about advertising. No advertising image could work without being associated with it a kind of claim on identity. This is the sort of object which those sorts of people in that kind of setting or in that sort of mood are likely to use and wear. So the whole range of visual imagery does come with a kind of identification tag linked to it. Now, I've moved, you may notice, from the word identity, an identity claim, to identification. And what I'm asking in the case of an advertisement, say, is what is the degree to which, in some way, you can project yourself into the image so that you can place yourself within the field of what is being represented to you. Most advertising works with by attempting to win identification. And if there's no identification going on at all, if you say, I don't know what it would be like to feel like that person, I've never seen anybody like that, I can't imagine myself ever being like that, etc. Even in my fantasies, there's no identification at all. It's very difficult to, you can get the meaning in a kind of abstract way, but the meaning doesn't begin to register, it doesn't begin to make a kind of claim on you. It is trying to construct a position of knowledge or identification for the viewer in relation to what has been depicted in the image. Now, we know that about advertising. It may be more difficult to see in terms of illustrations in the newspapers about events in faraway places, but even there, unless there's something in the picture with which you can even imaginatively or imaginarily identify, very difficult for the meaning to pass. But insofar as you pause, insofar as you don't do what you must do with our daily newspapers, is that, and you stop and look, it has arrested you. It has said, something for you here, something for you here. what can you then get out of the image? You can only get something out of the image if you position yourself in relation to what it's telling you. But what we've only gradually come to see is the way in which the viewer is himself or herself implicated, especially where the visual image is concerned, in the mode of looking, implicated through the look at the image, in the production of meaning through the image. So it is not that the image has a meaning, it is, as it were, in the relations of looking at the image which the image constructs for us, that meaning is completed. You might say the image has a whole range of potential meanings, but the meaning which you as a spectator takes depends on that engagement, psychic and imaginary engagement, through the look with an investment in the image or involvement in what the image is saying or doing. So that whereas we have a notion, in the way in which we talk about images, that images flood us and barrage us with meanings, as if we can stand outside of them and allow them to be there, the fact is that if we're concerned about the proliferation of images in our culture, it is because they constantly construct us through our fantasy relationship to the image in a way which implicates us in the meaning. And that is what is, in a sense, bothering us. We're not bothered because we are barraged by something which means nothing to us. We are bothered precisely by the fact that we are caught. We do have an investment in the meaning which is being taken from. Suppose, you said, I look at this athlete, but I don't see any of the meanings that you are telling me I should see. What can be the answer to that? One potential answer is, well, of course, you're not looking right. you need a course in cultural studies to know how to look at it properly. Then you'll be saturated by images and meanings. But that's not I'm not going to retreat to that dodge. I'm going to say that is because the image has no fixed meaning. It has potentially a wide range of meaning. And consequently, the task that we are involved in is a task which many methodologies in cultural studies, like formal semiotics, for instance, did try to make into a kind of scientific study. So there would be some way of proving that this was a meaning of the image which everybody would take. And if only we could have got as scientific as that, the question of meaning would have been resolved. And that was impossible, because there is no escape from the fact that meaning is, in the end, interpretation. It always shifts from one historical setting to another. It is always contextual. Only within a certain context can you say, that seems to me to be a stronger meaning than that. We can have a debate about meaning and representation, but it is a debate about which is more or less plausible reading of an interpretation of an image. What we cannot say, that is true and your reading is wrong. And if in this field one succumbs to the illusion of believing that one can climb out of the circle of meaning and somehow reach for the final scientific proof which will hold the image still, you have only to wait 5 days, 2 days, 3 days, talk to somebody else, go out of the room and come back in, and the meaning is on the slide. It has shifted on you. You can't, the things that you thought were important don't seem to be the things that are marking anymore. Things that you thought you hadn't seen, you now see. Someone else will say, oh, I see it differently. There is absolutely no escape from that contestation over meaning. Now, let me put that around another way. Does that mean that, that all the meanings are just float around? Everything means 1,000 different things, and you can get into a proliferation, a wonderful formal, what the French call jouissance, a kind of quasi-orgasm of meaning, just more of it, as much of it as you can get, the kind of pleasure of the image. Well, yes and no, yes and no. Now, the meaning can never be fixed, but if you want to say, even provisionally, well, I sort of think it means this, you have got to stop it. You've got to fix it. You've got to privilege that meaning for the time being. May not be forever. You may take it back tomorrow. But meaning depends on a certain kind of fixing. On the other hand, meaning can never be finally fixed. So what we're looking at is a practice which is always going to be subverted. And, the purpose of power, when it intervenes in language, is precisely to absolutely fix. That is what we used to call ideology tries to do. It tries to say, I can tell you what the meeting in Northern Ireland today means. That is what it means. It doesn't mean anything else. It's not going to change. Tomorrow it's going to mean the same thing. It aims to fix the one true meaning. And the only hope you have about power in representation is that it's not going to be true. That tomorrow somebody's going to make a slightly different sense of it. Meaning is going to come out of the fixing and begin to loosen and fray. And therefore, it's not a sort of, postmodern playfulness which insists on the relative openness of the meaning. It is absolutely central to a historical notion that meaning can be changed. It can only be changed if it cannot finally be fixed. Because you bet your life that the attempt to fix it is why power intervenes in representation at all. That is what they are trying to do. They want, as it were, the relationship between the image and a powerful definition of it to become naturalized, so that that is the only meaning it can possibly carry. Whenever you see that, you will think that. Whenever you see those people, you will assume they have those characteristics. Whenever you see that event, you will assume it has that political consequence. That's what ideology tries to do. That's what power in signification is intended to do. To close language, to close meaning, to stop the flow. If you think of an area in which an enormous amount of work has been done in media studies, which is the area of stereotyping, gender stereotypes, class stereotypes, racial and ethnic stereotypes, you will see the way in which stereotyping is exactly an attempt to fix. Every time you see this kind of image, these are the limited range of characteristics which one assumes is going to be implicated in the image. That's how stereotype functions. People have assumed that, therefore, what this is doing is a powerful way of circulating in the world a very limited range of definitions of who people can be, what they can do, what are the possibilities in life, what are the nature of the constraints on them. I mean, the image is producing not only identification, which I talked about before, it's actually producing knowledge. What we know about the world is how we see it represented. So the struggle to open up stereotypes is often a struggle to increase the diversity of things which subjects can be, of the possibilities of identities which people had not seen represented before. It's a very important, that is the politics of the image. Now, as you may know, there have been a number of different strategies with respect to this. The most common strategy is what is sometimes called positive representation, where you have a negative field of stereotypes and you try to intervene in it to represent the negative group in a more positive way, try to reverse the stereotypes. But I want to say to you that that there is a problem in attempts to reverse stereotypes in this way, because it's as if you could guarantee that having put positive images of black men and women in the place where negative images existed before, you could somehow maintain a positive regime of representation in the place of the stereotype representation which you've had before. But the actual practice suggests to us that just as, unfortunately, you can't fix, just as impossible for them to fix bad representation, so it's almost impossible for us to fix good ones. The strategies of the politics of the image has to take a very different and much less guaranteed route, in my view. It has to go inside the image itself. Inside the image. Because stereotypes themselves are really actually very complex things. It has somehow to occupy the very terrain which has been saturated by fixed and closed representations, and try to use the stereotypes, to turn the stereotypes, in a sense, against themselves. Tries to open up, in other words, the very practice of representation itself as a practice. Because what closure in representation does, most of all, is it naturalizes the representation to the point where you cannot see that anybody ever produced it. It seems to be just what the world is. It's just how it looks. That is just what reality is. So the very act of opening up the practice by which these closures of imagery have been presented requires one to go into the power of the stereotype itself and begin to, as it were, subvert, open, and expose it from inside. And that has, I think, a much more profound effect in shifting the disposition of images which circulate, for instance, in the media, although I want to remind you that there's no way in which that will be, that's guaranteed either. There's no guarantee in meaning. There's no way in which you can prevent a stereotype from being pulled back to some of its more stereotypical form. But you can engage in a way which begins to open the stereotypes up in such a way that they are kind of uninhabitable for very long. Well, I mean, one could push this very much further. For instance, if you wanted to take the point which I was just making, you might think about a trope of representation, for example, like fetishism. Like the fetishism which one finds, the fixing of particularly sexual imagery in relation both to race and to gender, which has been such a feature of a lot of negative stereotyping. And you might ask yourself whether, if you were trying to intervene in this field, whether the best thing to do would be to leave the fetishism alone, abandon it, to give it up, never go near it, because it's so contaminated by the stereotypical uses to which it has been put. Or whether, quite the opposite, you would go exactly into the nature of fetishism itself because of the secret power which it has. I mean, it has operated to stabilize stereotypes for a reason, not just for a joke, because it has very powerful powers of identification in fantasy. And if you want to begin to change the relationship of the viewer to the image, you have it to intervene in exactly that powerful exchange between the image and its psychic meaning. The depths of the fantasies, which collective and social fantasies with which we invest images in order to, as it were, expose and deconstruct the work of representation which the stereotypes are doing. I talked about the way in which the image operates through the marking of presence and absence. I talked about the importance of difference. It is what is different from what is expected, the marking of what is different from what is expected, that, as it were, allows meaning to begin to operate. I've talked about the importance of the way in which the image implicates us in the production of meaning. And I talked about the question of power and of closure in representation, what that closure is about, that is, as it were, how symbolic power operates in representation, and an attempt to naturalize the meaning so that we don't have any other way of thinking, any other access to knowledge about what is being told us about the world but the way in which it is being interpreted, and why, therefore, an attempt to keep representation open is a way of constantly wanting new kind of knowledges to be produced in the world, new kinds of subjectivities to be explored, and new dimensions of meaning which have not been foreclosed by the systems of power which are in operation.
Gonna have a big tea party and I'll invite all my disco friends. Sit around and chill afternoon. Talk about all the boys that we have done. What shall we eat? Something that's new. Cucumbers and everything noble meat. I'm gonna have a big tea party and I'll invite all my disco friends. And I'll invite all my disco friends.
Hey, I invited the band over tonight. This is Alan. Here's Dave. And Bob. And you already know me, I play slide guitar. And we're going to talk about the DIY, do-it-yourself method of putting out your own record. We just put out a 7-inch.
7 inches? You ask why. Airplay, baby.
The first thing you have to do is practice a lot, write some good songs, and then record.
Now, a lot of bands, they go into these big, expensive studios doing 24 tracks, 16 tracks. You don't need that. Get yourself a nice little 4-track. That'll do it. Play good, and you're there. We don't have to throw money down the drain.
To make 500 7-inches, you need at least $500 to get it pressed.
Turnaround time on delivery, 2 weeks.
To put out a CD, you're going to need double or triple that amount. Okay, we're really excited. We just got our box of records in the mail, 500 copies of our new single. While we were waiting for them to be pressed, I searched the internet and I found a site that sold plastic bags that you put the records in. And then Dave and I designed this cover. This is just a regular Xerox that we cut down by ourselves to size. All right, now the hard work starts. You gotta fold your covers in half, you gotta stick a record in, you gotta stuff it in the bag, and you gotta do it 500 times.
Okay, now it's all packaged up and ready to go, and what you want to do is get it out on the streets. So you go to your local record stores, preferably ones that sell your kind of music. You can sell it to them on consignment. You give them the records and they give you a receipt. And you can check back periodically and just see if they're selling.
Get as many copies as you put out to as many people as you can. Through radio stations, airplay, the fanzines. They'll write about you. It's a free ad. Try to reach the masses.
Okay, now we're getting ready for one of the most fun parts, the record release party. Write a very clear press release and send it to your local newspaper. Put the time, the date, the location, something about the record. Write a bio of the band, say a little something about each person, any other records you put out. Take some good photos of the band, just have a friend come up with a regular camera. Make up some flyers and an invite you can mail out to your friends and hand out at other events and post in cool, groovy shops. And this is your invitation to tune in next time for the record release party.
Circumcision. How do you decide what's right for your baby? You can listen to the experts.
In Thai, Naktin Gawa. Circumcision prevents self-abuse.
Because it is the will of God.
It's cleaner and healthier. Isn't it?
You don't want him to feel different from all the other boys, do you?
Don't worry. It won't hurt him a bit.
Circumcision. You can listen to the experts. Or you can listen to your baby.
You are watching DUTV, Cable 54 in Philadelphia.
收礼只收脑白金，脑白金年轻态健康品，宝硕德玛斯海豚牌塑钢门窗，宝硕集团调节免疫，抑制肿瘤，保护肝脏，补王虫草精，补王南瓜茶，调节血糖，北京4博联。一颗明珠，万国建筑的一部经典，啤酒飘香的一座名城，对外开放的一片热土，中国青岛。
这里弥漫过甲午战争的硝烟，这里被秦始皇称为天之尽头。如今，这里是世界上最适合人类居住的范例城市之一——威海 China。
跌打扭伤、各种骨折，请用正骨水。鸡骨草胶囊用于急慢性肝炎、胆囊炎。湿毒青胶囊用于皮肤瘙痒症。广西玉林制药。联通1019果蔬盛会，世界瞩目，中国烟台，技术相互交流，贸易平等往来，资本自愿联手，世界果蔬大盛会，每年10月看烟台。穿金猴皮鞋，走金光大道，金猴集团。
中国中央电视台国际频道荟萃全台新闻栏目精华，竭诚为广大观众提供及时全面的新闻信息。新闻联播报道中国大事，关注世界焦点，全面反映中国时事政治民生，权威发布中国政府立场。中国财经报道提供专业经济信息，服务投资创业及中国世界经济新闻于一体。经济半小时， 深入报道经济发展动态，具体分析经济行业走向，提供各层面供求信息。今日中国的信息尽在中国中央电视台国际频道新闻栏目。中国报道，中国中央电视台深度时事报道栏目，每天一期，每期30分钟，报道国内外大事。中国报道用报道与访谈为一体，每日邀请高层官员、权威专家、知名学者纵论天下大事。中国报道全面关注中国国情，关注全球热点，不同时区黄金时段均能收看。中国报道向世界报道中国，以中国人的视点报道世界。欢迎收看中国报道。
缅甸和菲律宾独立102周年和中菲建交25周年。李鹏委员长抵达南斯拉夫访问。台湾今晨再次发生里氏5级余震。斐济正面头目斯佩特车队遭政府军袭击。各位好，欢迎收看中国新闻节目。来看今天的详细内容。中国国家主席江泽民今天致电俄罗斯总统普京，祝贺俄罗斯国庆日。
贺电说，值此俄罗斯联邦国庆日之际，我谨代表中国政府和中国人民，并以我个人的名义，向阁下并通过阁下向俄罗斯人民致以诚挚的祝贺和良好的祝愿。俄罗斯人民是勤劳智慧的人民，我相信在阁下的领导下，俄罗斯必将在振兴国家的伟大事业中取得更大的成绩。中俄建立和发展战略协作伙伴关系是两国人民做出的正确的历史选择。在双方的共同努力下，中俄关系必将在新世纪中焕发出更加蓬勃的生机。祝友好的俄罗斯联邦国泰民安，祝中俄两国人民的友谊万古长青。
中国国家主席江泽民还在6月9号致电菲律宾总统埃斯特拉达，祝贺菲律宾独立102周年和中菲建交25周年。本月9号和12号分别是中菲建交25周年和菲律宾独立102周年纪念日。9号，埃斯特拉达总统也就菲中建交25周年致电江泽民主席。全国人大常委会委员长李鹏昨天下午抵达贝尔格莱德，开始对南斯拉夫联盟共和国进行正式友好访问。
南斯拉夫联盟议会公民院主席米尼奇、共和国院主席博若维奇及夫人到机场迎接李鹏委员长和夫人朱琳一行。中国驻南大使潘占林和夫人以及使馆工作人员、华人代表也到机场迎接。军乐队奏两国国歌。李鹏在机场向新闻界发表讲话，表示，他期待着同南联盟领导人就共同关心的问题深入交换意见，广泛接触各界朋友，探讨扩大两国间合作的途径。当天晚上，李鹏委员长出席了南联盟两院主席为他一行来访举行的欢迎宴会。南联盟公民院主席米尼奇在致辞中说，1997年11月，米洛舍维奇总统与江泽民主席在北京签署的关于南中友好合作关系的联合声明，为两国关系的发展奠定了基础。我们尤其赞赏中国在南反对外来压力和干涉、维护主权和领土完整的斗争中，在重建和发展中所给予的支持和帮助。李鹏致辞说，南斯拉夫是一个风光秀美、文化灿烂的国家， 长期以来抗击外来侵略的历史，造就了南斯拉夫人民英勇顽强的品格。为医治战争创伤，你们以艰苦奋斗的精神投身到重建家园的伟大事业之中。我们相信，你们一定能够克服暂时的困难，迅速走上稳定发展的道路。李鹏强调，中国人民十分钦佩南斯拉夫人民独立自主的精神，坚决支持南人民反抗外来侵略的斗争，主张在维护南斯拉夫主权和领土完整、确保科索沃各民族合法权益、遵守联合国安理会有关决议的基础上，在联合国范围内谋求科索沃问题的政治解决。李鹏说，中国愿意包括南斯拉夫在内的所有热爱和平的国家一道，共同致力于建立公正合理的国际政治经济新秩序。
继11号的6.8级地震之后，12号清晨4点11分，台湾再次发生里氏5级的地震。此次余震震中在玉山东北部45公里处，震央深度26.6公里。从11号凌晨2点23分发生6.8级的地震后，到12号已经陆续发生有感和无感余震200多次。到目前为止，已经有2人在地震中死亡，受伤的人数已经增加到68人。台湾气象局地震测报中心的分析，未来短时间内附近地区仍可能发生5级以上的余震。另外，从11号凌晨到目前为止，陆续发生的地震和余震已经造成南投县境内多处道路塌方。据气象部门的预测，未来几天台湾岛将出现暴雨天气，有可能威胁台湾中部山区，由于地震变得松软不堪的山体，造成泥石流或山崩等灾害。中央台驻香港记者报道。中国保监会今天宣布，对3家严重违反有关保险法规的外资保险机构驻华代表处予以撤销。3家被撤销的外资代表处分别是美国旅游家保险集团北京代表处、香港贵江保险代理有限公司北京代表处、平安保险美国有限公司北京代表处。中国保监会有关负责人指出，上述3家代表处在工作中或擅自变更地址，或没有提供每年的工作报告以及所代表公司每年的年报，其行为严重违反了外资保险机构驻华代表机构管理办法。福建省省长习近平12号在澳门表示，福建将与澳门特别行政区在5个领域加强合作，努力开创闽澳经贸合作的新局面。习近平12号在向澳门特区各界人士介绍福建省社会经济发展状况和设想时指出，由于福建与澳门有着特殊的历史渊源，所以福建省将努力促进与澳门特区之间的联系与合作，尤其在高科技、旅游、经贸、涉及与台湾的合作，以及参与祖国西部大开发等5个领域着重加强合作。习近平指出，福建与澳门交往的历史源远流长，早在500多年以前，福建的先民就把妈祖文化传到澳门来。至今，澳门同胞之中有1/4祖籍是福建，他们语言相通，文化相同，而且与台湾都有着密切的联系。澳门到福州、厦门和武夷山的空中航线已经开通，许多台湾同胞都是利用澳门一机到底的优势，通过澳门往返于福建与台湾之间。目前，福建省与澳门特区已经开展了比较广泛的旅游经贸合作。习近平同时表示，看好在高科技领域和参与祖国西部大开发方面的合作。澳门特区政府和中央驻澳门联络办公室官员都表示，将努力促进澳门特区与福建以及其他内地省份之间的经贸合作。中央台驻澳门记者报道。以下是广告时间，稍后向您报告国际新闻。
述大海豪情，访孔子故里，登泰山之巅。山东 China，
神话、传说、人间仙境。大海在这里分界，风光在这里汇合。这里是您梦中的海市蜃楼——山东蓬莱。白头山，联合国人与自然的保护绿色示范区的荣誉，天上人间的好饮品，白头山真诚的奉献。
德福品牌，一身德福，德福一生。斯凯衬衫，穿斯凯服装，展国货风采。四川德阳诚邀您共同开发西部沃土。
来看国际方面的消息，叙利亚官方昨天宣布，阿萨德总统的葬礼将于13号在他的故乡盖尔达哈举行。
盖尔达哈位于首都大马士革西北200公里的地方，阿萨德的遗体将用飞机运往那里。届时，许多国家都将派出代表参加葬礼。目前，叙利亚已进入40天的全国哀悼期，许多叙利亚群众走上街头，用各种方式对阿萨德表示悼念。另据报道，中国国家主席江泽民、埃及总统穆巴拉克等世界各国领导人纷纷致唁电或发表讲话，对叙利亚总统阿萨德逝世表示哀悼，并高度评价他为中东和平做出的贡献。此外，以色列内务部长11号宣布，将向所有想去参加阿萨德葬礼的戈兰高地群众发放签证。中央台编译报道。
本台消息，中国政府特使、国务委员司马懿·艾麦提今天下午离开北京赴叙利亚参加叙利亚总统阿萨德的葬礼。斐济政变头目斯佩特的车队12号上午在首都苏瓦遭到政府军士兵的袭击，但是没有人员的伤亡。当时斯佩特的军队强行通过检查站，政府军士兵向空中鸣枪警告，随后向斯佩特乘坐的汽车开枪，汽车玻璃被打碎。坐在另一辆车上的斯佩特随从被短暂扣留。政府军指挥官表示，这是一起意外的事件，士兵的行动是不对的。斯佩特发言人声称，这是一起经过授意的刺杀未遂行动。他扬言，政府军此举将使被扣的30名人质处境危险。上月19号，斯佩特以维护斐济族人利益为由发动政变，扣押了印度族人总理乔杜里，并自封为总理。本月初，斐济武装部队司令班尼马拉马宣布实行军管，并出任总统，双方僵持至今。中央台编译报道。埃塞俄比亚政府发言人11号宣称，埃塞军队在10号与厄立特里亚军队交火中俘虏了几百名厄立特里亚士兵。埃塞方面当天还宣称是在西部前线的交火中俘虏这些俄军士兵的。除此之外，埃塞军队还缴获了大量的武器弹药及坦克等战利品。但在厄立特里亚首都阿斯马拉，一位总统发言人表示，在战略要地阿萨布的战斗中，俄方已经完全击退了埃塞军队的进攻。尽管埃俄双方的武装冲突仍然持续不断，但非同组织仍然不遗余力地为双方达成停火协议而努力。中央台编译报道。各位观众，这次新闻节目播送完了，谢谢收看，再见。
那时候就因为我爸有病，家里维持不了生活，就失学了。我们村就历史以来没有超过小学3年级的。我奶奶90岁到这当烹饪西，到她去世就83岁吧，就没出过这山。每天就吃饱肚子，我想比她强也强不了多少。如果没有上学的机会的话，我第一次上县城去的时候都不知道男女厕所在哪。当时就是想只有念书才能够走出大山。出来并不是说是要为自己想到什么，我要回到我们村儿，为山里的孩子们做点什么事情。我的理想就是想当一名老师，我也想带着学生到外面去看看，到天安门啊，到登城啊，特有意思。我最幸运的就是有了第2次上学的机会。
我很喜欢熊猫，我已经从事大熊猫研究16年了。熊猫是一个古老的动物，它是个退化的物种。比如说那个雄性大熊猫的生殖器都严重退化。这以前就在90年以前只繁殖了1胎大熊猫，成后1只。我们这几年最大的成果就是我们最近生了17胎，25个小崽，现在活了14个崽。因为有3个熊猫都是第一次生崽，有2个都不会带孩子。一个熊猫妈妈听到熊猫小崽一生下一叫，它马上就吓得跑，抱着头都躲到屋就去了。另外一个妈妈根本就不带小孩，不知道让他小孩去吃奶，我们就跟他放录像，把会带的熊猫的录像给他看，不断的给他看，而且把熊猫小崽的叫声让他听，一下就会带了。现在小崽已经是10多天了，带的挺好挺好的。 要把这熊猫呢培训，逐渐培训到，然后放回到野外去，壮大野生种群，这是我们未来的最大目标。
刚解放不识字的人很多很多的，就是连村里个写底子、写信人都没有。我16岁是1951年初中毕业了，我就开始扫盲了。村里所有人都是我的学生，男的、女的、老的、少的啊。一般的教学方法不行，啊，也就是说是他不学，非给他往里灌啊，这个不行。当时的我就用教具教学演示，每一次每一个新课我都要编一个教具。学生们呢，每天晚上不很知道啊，好像跟看把戏是一样呀。扫盲班有个校歌：咱们识了字，提高了文化。这个通过扫盲毕业，我有办夜扫班、办农技班、办专业技术培训班，这样的学生越来越多。从外边来的学生也参加我这个学习了。我连扫了3代文盲。
本栏目由怡中集团特约播映。怡中集团。
正点相约
就在精彩时分。我们的节目是每周5期，每期10分钟，
每期一首歌曲一个话题。
今天我们欣赏的歌曲呢，是由江月演唱的《年轻的感觉》。
我想我们的话题呢也跟年轻有关。好，
请来2位嘉宾。
这位是青年歌手江月，你好。
你好，大家好。
这位呢是年轻的歌手蒋小涵。
啊，叔叔好，大家好。
他们2个现在你很年轻，但是呢，从很小很小就更年轻的时候就开始唱歌了。
对，
那个江月也是从很小。
对，我是特别小，6岁的时候。
6岁啊，蒋小涵从8岁的时候呢已经在电视上录晚会了。
所以他们没有白白的浪费青春，早早就有了果实了。江月，我知道今年在春节晚会上有一个歌唱的，
对，那个是那个打电话那个节目，
穿的黑色西装，
对，黑色西装，拿了一把吉他。
就是小帅哥啊，
很帅。
我们的蒋小涵呢，也是很久很久以前，就10年前了，就被大家所熟悉了。演唱的歌曲呢，深受大家的喜欢，
谢谢。
尤其是扮演那个宋丹丹演的小品啊，
模仿
模仿。
对，
那个模仿秀最早就是他开创的。今天我们看到几位年轻的人坐在一起以后，那个精神面貌，包括长的那个个头，我们都望尘莫及。
现在我们这一代可能就改革开放以后啊，我们各方面都好，生活都好了，然后我们天天都可以有很多业余生活。我们是看着电视长大的，
对，
你们是长到了10几岁，然后才看上了彩色的电视。
10几岁。哎呦，都快30岁了。
我觉得那时候应该精神上都特别单纯，特别快乐哈。像我们现在，我觉得精神压力挺大的，因为在学校里
压力
啊，怎么没有高中生的压力？谁还能比高中生还忙啊？
真的啊，
高中生每天那么多的功课。
可能我觉得啊，
对，
我觉得你们那个时候虽然说生活比较单纯啊，比较单一啊，但是我们这方面就比较多元化啊。但是我们就是换了一种方式了。
对，
我们有很多的功课，我们很多的事情，我们要做很多作业。
对，你以为我们当时上学的时候就没有很多的功课，没有好多的作业？
没有，我觉得
我们好像他们就是外界的诱惑比较少。现在那么多的电视，
世界很精彩。
现在的中学生这个喜欢看的东西，喜欢听的音乐都跟我们以前大不相同。
我们的节目是每周5期，每期10分钟，
对着观众乐，
代表了一个时代的潮流。
麻烦您给我补张票，
给你我的爱，
就觉得很快乐。
说上3言2语，听听话外之音，歌中有你有我，共享精彩时分。
假如说有一个小朋友跟你们一边大的，天天要抱着一录音机，天天在听京剧，你们会以为怎么着了？
我觉得很正常，但是没法交流。
觉得年轻 轻人，他们的选择可能都是最前卫、前沿的。
对
其实，保罗，我想你们那个时代对这个时尚肯定也有一些追求。当时穿什么最时髦呢？
就是这个黄军装，
是吧？
谁那时候有一个黄军装，而且戴一个那个黄军帽？你不信问问你妈妈、你爸爸啊，那个时候感觉哎呦羡慕至极呀。
可能你们那种感觉。
到了我们那时候是穿这个牛仔裤，而且呢，我记得很清楚。
喇叭裤过去了吧？
不是，当时对，当时我们买了一个牛仔裤之后，我买的是回去我就拿剪子剪掉了，然后就变成那毛边。我妈说的，哎呀，干什么呀？这么好的裤子就剪掉了。当时就觉得很时髦。但是现在我看他们穿衣服，我也有点看不惯了。我觉得那个衣服裤腿这么宽，滴了当啷的，他们说叫什么新兴人类，但是我很接受不了。
我觉得这是一个潮流的一个发展。那么它发展到现在的，它那个服装各方面都会有改变。像那刚才赵老师说他穿黄军装啊，什么东西，可能你们对那种追求的感觉就跟我们现在追求那种宽裤子，然后很宽松、
厚底鞋、
很运动的那种感觉，很随便那种感觉。可能我们现在追求的那种东西跟你们以前那种感觉是一致的，但是它总的来说就是一种潮流的在发展。
对，
那么追求的还是在追赶的那个年轻的那种感觉，追赶的还是那种潮流在发展的那种动力。
而且现在更能包容了。如果你当时穿黄军装那时候，突然有个人穿一大肥裤子，你们肯定就会惊呆了，觉得很惶恐，这怎么回事？但是如果现在我们都穿肥裤子，即便是我出来穿个军装，大家也觉得很个性，很好。
因为现在就是
对能够彼此包容
很多。
现在是个性选择。你刚才蒋小涵讲的那个非常有道理，就是说我要发展我自己。那么我自己有个性，这个个性要区别于他人，同时要奔成功之路。
大家就是都在竞争，然后每个人都觉得自己是最棒的，所以你周围你的所有的对手他都是最棒的。所以我觉得这个我们大家所开拓、所要创造的就是一种特色。我觉得保持一个自己的特色，所以你在你这个特色里面你是出色的，那你就是最棒的。
对，
我就是这么认为。
说的很对啊，就是说他觉得，就是说每个人都必须要有自己的特点。现在讲求的是个人的一种个性化的东西，不是说像以前千篇一律都是每个人都是一样的东西。
而且21世纪对人才的这种要求标准也发生变化，要求的是有创造性思维，而且有充分的实践经验的这样的人才。对，那我觉得这个人才最重要的还是一个心理素质。对，心理素质其中我觉得一个年轻的、正常的一个平和的心态是最重要的。
我觉得人的年轻啊，只有那么一段时间，每个人只有这么一次，应该把握这时光。就像江烈那首歌唱到，就是我们不愿面对失败，其实是不可能的，这是一个美好的愿望。我们
在失败当中学习，
我们一定会面对的。但是面对失败的时候，我们一定要有一颗坚强的心。
在分区的日历中慢慢长大，对年轻什么都不怕。的笑容还是有点傻，但是面对一切都不挣扎。每做一件事都会很多想法，每看一个主题都很惊讶。面对成功他还是挺潇洒，说的时候他还是哭了。我们年轻的不知什么是疲惫，我们用青春追赶自己的完美，我们跳动的心像一江春水，自信的笑容什么都敢面对。我们是春天最美的花蕾，我们用青春去把将来描绘，我们从不去想失败的滋味，因为年轻就是一切之最。 时候他还是哭了。我们年轻的不知什么是疲惫，我们用青春追赶自己的完美，我们跳动的心像一江春水，自信的笑容什么都敢面对，我们是春天最美的花蕾，我们用青春去把将来描绘，我们从不去想失败的滋味，因为年轻就是一切之最。我们年轻的不知什么是疲惫，我们用青春追赶自己的完美，我们跳动的心像一江春水，自信的笑容什么都敢面对，我们是春天最美的花蕾，我们用青春去把将来描绘，我们从不去想失败的滋味，因为年轻就是一切之最。
1963年7月，我国第一门多管火箭炮诞生。
蔡元兴同志挂帅呢，要搞101委员会。
破解比苏联都是邪见的。
为我军这个取得战斗的胜利奠定了良好的基础。
人民解放军炮兵是伴随着南昌起义的炮声诞生的，而我军炮兵武器装备最初多来源于战场上的缴获。新中国成立后，炮兵武器的研制才起步。到1958年，火炮技术趋于成熟，开始研制威力更大的多管火箭炮。
过去我们使用的是手榴弹可救式火箭炮，但是那个可救式呢又比较笨重，是轨道式的，啊。这个一发射呢，光线很大，所以发现以后敌人很快就能发现。后来我们就研究了自己的火箭炮，主要是加强这个地面炮兵的威力。
根据国防建设的需要，多管火箭炮定为130毫米19管火箭炮，用汽车运载，要求火箭炮密集度好，高低方向射角大，适合现代化作战要求。这一历史重任就落在了国营247厂的肩上。
在1958年，由这个山西军区副司令员蔡元兴同志挂帅呢，要搞101委员会，在我们国家研究火箭武器。
党的要求从这个射程上也好，精度上也好，必须超过苏联，
因为这种武器的话呢，没有搞过，从工程人员也好，工厂也好，没有生产过，也没有设计过。正又因为当时这个情况呢，这个各种大亚中院校的学生并不多，所以呢，这一次的研制除了一些大专毕业生以外，主要是中专毕业生，所以我们当时就认为一定要激我的出凤凰。
靠着一股闯劲儿和对国防事业的追求，他们在3周内就研制出一种8管山地火箭炮。它虽在结构性能上存在许多问题，但能发射炮弹，这是火箭炮研制工作从无到有的第一步。凭着这个雏形，研制人员开始了向更高峰的攀登。
这个武器呢，最大的问题呢，就是说，像这个发射的间隔器，怎么叫这火炮稳定下来以后呢，才再打一发，这精度才能提高。炮的震荡，这个怎么能和设计能够配合起来？这个费了很大的劲，反复试验。我们有的工程技术人员呢，在东北那么冷的天气，在零下-40度，在车里一冒的话冒2个多小时。
从 从8管火箭炮到19管火箭炮，经过2年多的研究，3次大的改进后，1962年终于使火箭炮各项指标达到了要求。
射的精度在300米这么一个这个长度，在500米的一个宽度中间，这19把都打到这个圈里去。如果有4门炮同时连放的话，这威力是相当大。
咱们这个火箭比苏联都是先进的啊。就它这个第一个，就它这个弹是改成涡轮弹，
射程远了，一般的是8公里，这个炮10公里。其他那个炮的话，就没有什么精度要求，纵向没要求。这个呢，纵向、横向都有了要求。
因为它火力比较突然，比较猛烈，给敌人精神上面很大的威胁，为我军这个取得战斗的胜利奠定了良好的基础。
经过几十年的研制开发，我军炮兵武器装备取得了长足的进步，形成了地面炮兵与高炮、防空导弹相结合的武器体系。人民炮兵已成为我陆军的主要兵种，也是保卫祖国、维护世界和平的主要力量。
Welcome to this edition of Around China. I'm Li Dongning in Beijing. Today we'll be staying here in wonderful Beijing, so please stay tuned. The city of Beijing distinguishes itself from any other city in the country with its strong cultural atmosphere that attracts people from all around China and abroad. In our program today, we'll talk to a New Zealander living in Beijing and studying Chinese Kung Fu. Then we'll visit a special primary school located in the temple. After that, we'll talk to Gu Lanqia, whose unique pastime is planting gourds. And finally, we'll introduce to you a master of jade carving. Please stay with us. Michael has been living in Beijing for 5 years. He spends most of his time studying Chinese Kung Fu. But more than a fun hobby, he's also attracted by the deep philosophy behind the Chinese martial art.
Michael, a Kiwi, has studied Chinese Kung Fu for nearly 5 years. He was captivated by it when he was very young. It was then that he decided that he would leave his home and go to China to learn Chinese Kung Fu. He had limited experience in the martial arts when he was young in New Zealand. The experience helped him build a certain foundation for further training in Beijing. There are many foreign students now studying Chinese Wushu at the Beijing Physical Training University, and Michael is one of them. During his 5 years of training, the thought that he would stop learning never entered his mind, even as he injured his knee during training. He believes that no one can guarantee his first rank in any field, and only depending on continuous training can he make improvement. He was upset when he was warned by the doctor not to do any physical exercise. Still, he continued to go to the gym and to train. Chinese martial arts are quite different from the martial arts he studied in New Zealand. Chinese martial arts are just one part of Chinese culture. They have a common bond with ancient Chinese philosophy. Through years of training, what impresses Michael most is Zheng Zhuang, standing meditation, which is the foundation of the martial arts.
Zheng Zhuang is what I do for 2 hours a day. And basically, what it is it's a standing meditation. It's the foundation of a martial art called Yi Quan. And Yi means thought, and Quan, this Quan is your fist. Fist, and Quan in Chinese means way, fist way, style, you could say, martial art, whatever. And they take Zheng Zhuang as their basis. They stand there. I stand there like this for 2 hours a day and then do nothing else. 2 hours a day. I just stand there. In New Zealand, people will know about meditation. People sit there like that, 坐禅, that's Zen Buddhism, whatever like that. And this is identical to 坐禅, except, and we have the same thing. We don't close our eyes, and we stand up, and we have a fighting posture. And but it's identical. In Chinese, it's called Li Chan Gong. When I'm standing there, I eventually do come to a time when I'm not thinking of anything. Where I just exist. I just expand. My body just expands. And but there's a process of thinking and thoughts that go to reach that jingye, that state.
Michael believes that the real Kung Fu is the martial arts of the heart. Regardless of the number of martial arts one masters, the outer movements must flow with the inner movements of the heart. Only then can one truly understand their meaning. And it marks the most significant change after his wushu training in China.
From karate, very rigid, to something that has no form. There's no form. I just stand there. It's all on the inside. And any way I choose to express myself, even dancing, it's the same. What's on the inside is the same. So the movement in the beginning, like that, okay. Now, I'm just here. And the movement's on the inside. If I want to move it, I can move it. The movement gets very progressively smaller for me. 大动不如小动，小动不如小动。大动不如小动，小动不如不动，不动之动才是生生不已之动。
Being from New Zealand, a tranquil place, Michael does not like the noisy downtown. He prefers the parks in Beijing and the Summer Palace, which is his very favorite.
Summer Palace is one of my places here in Beijing, one of my special places. And I take a book, I go there, and I sit there in the sun, I read my book, I sleep. I practice, I read, I sleep, I write, and I could spend the whole day, it goes like that. Bang.
Michael's mother and grandmother are quite proud of his growth and progress in Beijing. He himself has gained many other benefits from studying the martial arts.
My mom supported me. It's a dream, go for it. And it's a good way to learn about yourself and about other people. And about the world, because New Zealand's very small, and so it's a great way for me to learn about the world. Even if I was only to come to Beijing, I know so many different people from different countries that I learn a little bit about each country.
Time seems to have flown by quickly for Michael. He has become used to his life here. There's a motto at Michael's dormitory. It was written by Catherine Mansfield, a famous Kiwi writer, that somehow reflects Michael's personality. It goes something like this: risk anything, care no more for the opinions of others for those voices. Do the hardest thing on earth for you. Act for yourself. Face the truth.
Catherine Mansfield, she's a Kiwi author. You know, from a long time ago, female with ideas like that, very progressive, very much ahead of her time.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, hey, it's from a New Zealander, and it really reflects what I have to do, what I have to remember. I think if you can do that, hey, your life's sweet. So, well, I'm going to stay here. I still have a lot to learn. I'm going to work here in Beijing. I'm going to work here because I think it's a very exciting place to work.
Our second stop today is a primary school in Beijing. What makes this school so different is that class takes place every day in the temple. The temple's long history and the beautiful artwork have become further stimulus for the students here to succeed.
The Fushui Primary School is located along Fushui Lane. Every morning, students break the calm of the neighborhood as they head into school. The elegant antique gate hints at the school's long history. The antithetical couplet on the gate encourages the students and teachers to do their best.
我们学校原来是一个寺庙，当时叫报恩寺。在元末明初的时候，当时朱元璋率军攻陷元大都，他的大将徐达来到了这个地方，当时要执行他的一个命令，就是军队一律不许进入孔庙。这个寺庙的主持呢，当时为了躲避军队对这个寺庙的破坏，就急忙找了一个木质的孔子像，立在了门口，所以军队呢就没有进来。当他躲过了这个军队的扫荡之后呢，他又怕自己落一个欺君之罪的罪名，所以立即就在附近找了一些私塾先生和一部分孩子，在这儿来教学上课。这样的话呢，这个学校就出现了。
Today's students begin learning a second language from their very first day at the school. However, 600 years ago, the school offered only 5 courses. They were ethics, music, culture, mathematics, and archery. These courses were set by Zhu Yuanjiang, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty. He also required the teachers to foster philanthropic acts among the students. Enrollment in the school was very selective. Only intelligent and handsome young men over the age of 15 were admitted. And then only if they displayed a solid foundation in the Chinese classics. The emperor also demanded that only moral men of advanced learning be hired as teachers. He carved his requirements on a stone tablet.
妈妈一边说我，可是我的心却被电视紧紧地吸引住了，一个字也没听见。如果你能把这种著名的精英的学生能拿班里第一了。好，他妈妈说这句话更能反映出他什么？刘也说，更能反映他作为学生的是非常好，这是重点。就他妈妈说的这句话，更能反映出他喜欢什么？
Because of these strict requirements on the students, only a few candidates could be permitted. Each county was allowed 20 students. However, the government provided food and other daily necessities for the teachers and the students. This meant they were free to focus on teaching or learning. In the last years of the Qing dynasty, the Guangxu emperor began his reforms in education. The school's curriculum was expanded to include 9 courses, including morality, Chinese classics, literature, mathematics, history, science, art, music, and physical education. At that time, the students took 36 classes each week. Schooling lasted 3 years. However, the reforms were not very successful. Although more courses were offered, the students remained confined by conservative feudal thinking. Many stone tablets from the Ming and Qing dynasties can be found around the school's campus. The inscriptions tell how the students were recommended, selected and fostered. Details of numerous renovations that took place are also found in these stone records. The school was once a sprawling complex including halls for worship and for study. Today, only one hall remains standing, and there is no clear record of when this hall was built. Although much has changed, one thing remains the same. After 641 years, the school continues to foster bright graduates ready to benefit society and their country.
You're now watching Around China, a documentary program brought to you by CCTV. Today, our focus is the nation's great capital, Beijing. Before meeting our next guest, let's take a short break. We'll be back in a moment.
For your kaleidoscopic look at China and her people, tune in to Around China on CCTV International.
Welcome back. Many people tend to flowers in their spare time, but planting gourds may be one of the less popular pastimes. To Gu Langqiao, however, planting gourds has many rewards. This year, his harvest totaled 185 gourds. So why has he made this his hobby, and for what does he use the gourds? Let's talk to him and find out.
The vines thrive in the small space in front of his home. When the gourd is ripe, it will fall from the vine. This is the happiest time of all for Gu Yeqiao.
这我自己种葫芦啊，已经有3年，葫芦种类很多，我现在有5种，种了5种出来4种，这是一种，这是一种，这是一种。为了我这葫芦的形状呢，把它多样化一点，我还想给它造型。你看像这，这个套起来给它弄一个圆的，给那个喝这个矿泉水瓶子这样的。然后像这种用夹板把它夹起来，变成这个扁的。今年收成是最多，185，啊。不过到最后它免不了还有一些不够成熟的，估计去掉个1/3，还有100出头，啊，我大丰收。这就是我在葫芦上烫字烫这些小葫芦， 这个葫芦上呢是烫的知足常乐，3种字体都是知足常乐几个字。这是篆书，这是行书，这是草书。后边呢写上年月、地点，有时候在这个地方烫上一个自己的小章子。啊，你像这个葫芦就非常有意思，像一个破壳刚出来的小鸟。哎，那么我就给他写上了几行字，然后拿烙铁烫上。这几行字呢叫做羊羔跪乳，神鸦反扑，破壳鸟雏，鸦鸦待扑。这个很像，你看很像一个，这没画上了，这要画上一个眼睛啊，画上一个什么都更像。
Gu began etching the gourds 2 years ago. He loves drawing, and so he found it easy to put pictures and characters on the gourds. His only tool is a soldering iron, and the procedure he uses is very simple. First, he soaks the just-picked gourd in water.
Raised with here. You having a good time back?
Yeah, it's a great beach.
Now, what if I were to show you a whole bunch of great things you could do besides sitting on the beach? Would you maybe want to come back a little sooner than next summer?
Sure.
Ah, great. Well, if you call this number right here on the screen.
Where?
Right, excuse me?
What number?
What if I were to tell you that simply by calling this number on the screen... What screen?
Where?
You see it, don't you? Call the number on the screen, they'll shoot one right out to you. This one? All right, I'll call the number.
There's no question that these machines run modern businesses, or that demand will grow for people who can administer these networks. The opportunity exists. The question is, can the opportunity be yours? With a systems administration degree from Masters Institute, the answer is yes. More questions? Call Masters Institute. Higher education for a high-tech world.
The following is a paid presentation for Attacking Anxiety and Depression.
Dear Lucinda, as far back as I can remember, I always seem to have a problem with anxiety or nervousness.
I can't begin to tell you the changes that have taken place in my life. When I listened to the introductory tape, I knew immediately.
I experienced my first panic attack while driving my car home from a meeting. All of a sudden, out of nowhere,
Dear
I began
Lucinda,
to feel like...
on most occasions, a typical 40-minute commute home from work took me 2 hours. I was consumed
I
with
don't even know
scary
where to
thoughts.
begin. I suppose I will start by introducing myself as Alicia. Alicia who has suffered from anxiety and panic attacks for many, many years. Alicia who
I had those weird out-of-body feelings all the way home. It went downhill from there with daily panic attacks and extreme
I was
fear
always
attacks.
an anxious child. There were things I never wanted to do. I never wanted to go to movies, sleep over at people's houses, or even eat in restaurants.
Dear Lucinda, I'm writing you this letter to express my gratitude. In November of 1997, while going through our local newspaper, I saw an ad for a seminar in our area. My wife and I attended the seminar and ordered the program.
In elementary school, I remember I could never sleep. When I was in middle school, I was borderline anorexic for a while. High school, panic attacks started.
This thing caught up with me in my 30s. I don't know where it came from or how it came along, but I spent about 16 years in sheer hell. I mean, afraid, embarrassed, ashamed.
I really felt like I was going insane, and I felt like this was insanity. This is what people feel when they are going insane.
I began to have thoughts of that you're going to die in your sleep. When you lay down tonight, you're going to die. It was consuming my life, and I was not able to function and live a normal life.
Disorder is the #1 emotional problem in our country today. An estimated 1 out of 5 Americans have suffered or will suffer some form of anxiety disorder. One of the most commonly prescribed medications today is anti-anxiety medication. Many experts believe anxiety to be one of the primary causes of alcohol abuse.
I had anxiety and depression my whole life. And looking back now, I understand and I realize that it was an excuse. It was the reason I felt bad all the time. It was the reason nothing ever worked for me. It was the reason I wasn't happy. And it was the reason I couldn't control my bad moods. I was obsessed and consumed with worry. But you know, once I realized that it was just anxiety and that I could turn that anxiety around and learn how to take control of it and turn it into something positive, a whole new world opened up to me. And it's really what brought me to you.
When I decided to be a social worker, I thought, this is something that I want to do. I want to help people, and I know I can do this, and I'll be good at it. But throughout my college years and even getting into my career, I was struggling with anxiety. It would come and go at times, and sometimes it'd be gone for several months, and then it would come back. And when I think it really hit me was when I started dealing with some students that I was working with in the school system who were having problems with depression or anxiety. I would think, I don't know what to do with them. I don't know quite what to say to them. I can give ideas on lots of issues, but when it came down to the actual anxiety, I didn't know what to do myself. Since I've completed the program, I just feel like I'm a different person. Being in the counseling field, I have never come across anything like it. I just think it's a program that needs to be heard, and I think people need to give it a chance.
The Midwest Center is dedicated to the treatment of anxiety and stress and was founded by Lucinda Bassett and Dr. Philip Fisher. Their renowned program, Attacking Anxiety and Depression, has helped thousands of individuals to help themselves. Lucinda is a member of the Mental Health Association and the Anxiety Disorders Association of America and has had articles published in Longevity, Cosmopolitan, and Success magazine. She's been featured on nearly every major national talk show, including Oprah, Maury Povich, Regis and Kathy Lee, and Lisa.
Do you know what it's like to lie in bed at night with a million broken thoughts racing through your head, unable to sleep, feeling anxious for no real reason? Do you know what it feels like to sit and worry and obsess for hours about something someone said or did? And have you ever worried about your health to the point that you were convinced you were dying of something? Do you ever feel like you can't catch your breath, or like you can't sit still, or like you need to run, but you don't know where and you don't know why? I know what it feels like. I'm Lucinda Bassett, president of the Midwest Center for Stress and Anxiety, and I'm a recovered anxiety